Thank you. I assume you guys can hear me all right. Somebody towards the front needs to make sure that I stay kind of in this range here. That's my remit. Okay, stay in front of the stage. This is going to be informal because we're at the size of the room where I could almost ask everyone to go around and introduce themselves. All right, but I'm not going to do that. What I do want to visit with you about are things that candidly frustrate me in terms of the level that they're adopted in the beef industry. And I've often wondered, as we're encouraged to tell our story, right? As beef cattle producers, we're told to tell our story. I'm concerned that if we tell the whole story, which would include our reluctance to implement technology that we know works, that we actually might get a black eye, because it would be an admission that we have tools to decrease the unit cost of production, to increase consumer satisfaction, and we knowingly don't use them. So that's a large concern that I have. The current status, as I see it, ownership in the beef industry and thus decision-making is spread across a great many producers. And that's a large contrast compared to competing protein industries, swine and poultry, namely, right? So there's a lot of beef cattle producers that take decisions. Tools and knowledge exist to genetically improve fertility. Crossbreeding, early published examples around 1900, right, from an animal breeders roundtable discussing the benefits of crossbreeding, well-documented benefits by the 1980s. Expected progeny differences, or EPDs, you can think about the first sire summaries in Simmental in the early 1970s, and of course, widespread availability across all major U.S. beef cattle breeds today. And then selection indexes, the theory behind them published in 1942, first available in beef cattle by a breed association in about 2004, that was Charlet. Right, so tools that we know that work, that have been around a long time. The other part of the current status of the beef industry is that current germplasm is about, right, 70% of one breed. And so that's a concern. That's a concern. Not to say that that one breed doesn't have utility, but putting that much of our eggs into one basket is a concern. And survey results, I'd point you to Bob Weber and others in 2014, Beef Magazine in 2019. So the results from those surveys, plus my own experience, would suggest that commercial producers rely on visual appraisal and raw phenotypes to make selection decisions far more than I and others would like. And some of you, I'm not going to ask for a raise of hands, some of you may be guilty of that yourselves, right? And so when you do that, you impede progress in the U.S. beef industry. That's beyond contestation. So from the great philosopher, Jack Spangler, why? Jack's my 4-year-old son, and so that's a popular question around our house, right? Why are we where we are now? And why have our competitors adopted these things fully, right? Why is every pork chop we eat, unless it's a niche product, the product of a 3- or 4-way cross, the product of synthetic lines? Why were all of the parent stock chosen on economic selection indexes? And in beef cattle, it's not that way. I think it comes down to a fundamental misunderstanding of this equation. Okay, this is the basic genetic model. Phenotype, what we see, comes about through G&E, genetics and environment. Everyone's seen that before. The G can be split into 3 components. A is additive. That's what we use when we select on EPDs, the additive genetic merit. D is dominance. That's what we exploit when we crossbreeds. And then I is epistatic. Okay, the interactions among genes. And from a total genetic variation perspective, particularly additive genetics, epistatic variation doesn't explain a lot compared to the total, right? So we exploit both the A and the D part here simultaneously by selecting using EPDs and by taking advantage of a well-structured crossbreeding program. You've also probably seen this, right? That reproductive traits or fertility is lowly heritable, but benefits substantially from heterosis or from crossbreeding. Where I think the misunderstanding comes from, and we'll get into the details here in a minute, is that when we say reproduction is lowly heritable, I think somehow we've sent the signal that that means you can't change it using genetic selection. And that's a falsehood. You can't. It just takes longer. So what is heritability? Most would probably recognize it as the fraction of phenotypic variation due to variation in additive genetics. Higher heritability means we can make faster change, all else being equal. Low heritability, does not necessarily mean limited genetic variation. In fact, for most fertility traits, there's a substantial amount of variation, genetic variation for them, a substantial amount. The reason they're lowly heritable is because there's a lot of other variation acting on fertility, which we can't describe, okay? That's why it's lowly heritable. So let's go back to this model and where I think the misunderstanding comes from. I added another E. So we've got phenotype equals genotype plus environment, big E, plus little e, which I'm just going to call noise, right? It's air. We don't know what it is. Most heritability estimates from the literature come from models that adjust the P, adjust the phenotype for known sources of environment, right? So for contemporary group, which is birth year, season kind of stuff, right? For any known nutrient differences, right? You feed these animals different than you feed these animals. Maybe there's differences in synchronization protocol. All the things that we know that are non-genetic, we adjust for. And as a consequence, the heritability is the fraction of variation that's left over that's due to genetic variation. In other words, if the heritability is 10%, that doesn't mean the environment, all right, the known environment explains the other 90%. And that's where I think people have left talks like this, and you'll probably leave today's talk like this, confused, okay? We say heritability of fertility is 10%, and automatically my animal management colleagues in the room say, well, I'm responsible for the other 90%. No, you're not. No, you're not. There's a large chunk of variation from sources that we don't know about, okay? From sources we don't know about. Improvement of herd efficiency. I know this is a bit small. This is from Gordon Dickerson in the early 1970s, famous animal breeder, and really a pioneer in systems thinking from the University of Nebraska, who wrote out relatively simply his thoughts on herd efficiency and profitability at a herd level, which comes about through really cold value of the dam, the number of progeny and their weight, and then he subtracts off feed for the dams and feed for the offspring. And he said by simply increasing the number of progeny per dam, you can increase the efficiency of beef cattle production, and you can do that either through selection, genetic selection, heterosis from crossbreeding, or better management. So if we could come out with fewer open females by employing genetic selection and well-structured crossbreeding programs, that would go a long ways in increasing the efficiency of beef cattle production. In the preceding paper, and that preceding paper is meant to supplement the talk. In other words, I didn't refer back to what I wrote when I put together these slides because one was due long in advance of the other. So it was kind of the paper was what was on my mind when I was writing it. And then these slides were what was on my mind about 7 days ago. Okay, so they kind of complement each other in that sense. There are a lot of estimates, okay, about crossbreeding and heterosis in that paper. I didn't see the need to go through them again, but I just want to show this. And the impact is having crossbred dams. The vertical axis is improvement in weaning weight per cow exposed. The benchmark is straight bred cows. The green part of the bar is the increase in that metric you get from having crossbred females. And it's substantial. And it's even bigger if you cross Bos indicus and Bos taurus. Okay, even bigger benefit then. So a well-structured crossbreeding program needs to have crossbred females. This is from Warren Snelling and others here just a couple of months ago. Warren Snelling from the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center. I know this is hard to see, but what Warren did was he really asked the question, is there existing data that we can use to come up with novel measures of female fertility? Because that's always the crux in developing genetic predictions for female fertility, is getting phenotypes from beef cattle producers. And so he thought, well, maybe there's data already there that we can use. And one is just cumulative weaning weight. So cow has a calf, not adjusted weaning weight. And so her record for that year is the raw weight of that calf. And then she has a calf the next year, that calf's weight is added to the first calf, right? So it's cumulative weaning weight, which takes into account really, did she get pregnant? How early did she get pregnant? Because she gets pregnant earlier, her calf's gonna have an advantage in weaning weight. And is she able to do it every year? So kind of what we want to improve. So the points I want to show here are these two lines here, what I'm going to call blue and what I'm going to call purple. Okay, blue and purple. I'm not really good with colors, but for the sake of this, those are blue and purple. The blue part here is actually the amount of cumulative weaning weight that is due to dominance. All right, so kind of dominance heritability, and this is additive genetics. So both additive genetics and dominance acting on that kind of long-term sustained cow fertility trait, cumulative weaning weight, which means if you want to improve that metric, it's going to take selection on additive genetics and exploiting crossbreeding. It's going to take both of them to dramatically improve that trait. The other nice thing, though, is a trait like that could be easily developed using data we have in beef breed association databases right now, right? That would be pretty simple to develop. What's up here is actually mature cow weight, and that's heavily driven by additive genetic effects, not much of a dominance impact on that trait. All right, the traits of importance, if you want to select for fertility and really maternal characteristics in general, this is the list of traits here. The ones in blue, pardon me, we have genetic predictions for, we have EPDs for now. Maternal weaning weight, of course, we call that milk, which is a misnomer, but we've been calling it that for decades now, and we probably can't undo it. Contrast that to the list of traits that are important if you're thinking about terminal objectives, and it's a different list of traits. The reason I want to highlight this is I would argue the majority of sire selection focuses on this list of traits. Even though people want to develop replacement females, they still select bulls off of this list of traits. And that's counterproductive, unfortunately. But it can be hard if you're trying to do both things, right? You want to produce terminal calves, you also want to develop your own replacement females, and so you end up selecting or needing to select for a very long list of traits. And that's complex, I admit that. So life would be simpler if you didn't do it that way. Just took a stance and said, I'm not going to develop my own replacement females. I'm going to outsource that to somebody else that perhaps can do it better and cheaper than I can. I know that's a hard pill to swallow. Do it better and cheaper than I can because they can leverage economies of scale. The fact is the majority or a large fraction of feeder calves in the US come from small cow herds, right? They just do. Cumulatively, that's the way it works. And it seems logical that those herds would increase profit, probably enjoy life more if they purchased replacement females. And ideally, those replacement females would come bred with their second or later calf. Reason is because somebody already got them pregnant the first and second time, the hard times, they calved them out as a heifer. And so you're getting a running age cow that should be in a more productive period of her life. And that female should be crossbred. The other thing that I've never wrapped my head around is that female is at a discount compared to a bred heifer, generally. I've never been able to wrap my head around that, but she is. So there are advantages in doing that. Then bulls would be selected for terminal traits, the cows presumably selected for maternal traits, and that is true complementarity. And I would say that sex semen might play a role in such a system as well. If you don't believe me, that's fine. Maybe you believe Jack Whittier. That's a name some of you might recognize, right? Was on faculty at Colorado State and an administrator at University of Nebraska, where he says the customary approach has been to select and develop heifer calves on ranch. However, certain factors have led many managers to reevaluate their replacement female programs, and he lists 3 of them there. Right. So that's a system that could be implemented that I think inherently would increase profitability and fertility as well, because the females would be selected for maternal traits. So there's some advantages of such a system. Focusing objectives, increasing uniformity of calves industry-wide, less calving difficulty, and heavier calves from smaller calves. To develop breeding systems, though, it's important to understand how breeds compare today, not the way they compared 30 or 40 years ago, right? So this is a list of breeds, and on the right-hand side, what you have is corrected breed effect contrasted to Angus. So Angus is set as 0. This is for mature cow weight. So the interpretation is here on average, Hereford 30 pounds lighter at maturity than our Angus, right? And these were not adjusted for body condition score. This comes from the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center Germplasm Evaluation Project, right? Given what the standards of errors are on a lot of these, it means a lot of breeds kind of group together. Surprise, surprise, all breeds have gotten bigger in the past 3 decades, okay, which is unfortunate. But the important thing is more than necessarily who's bigger than whom. It's just a recognition that things have changed over time, right? This, I'll give you a couple minutes to write it all down. This is also from the U.S. Mark Germplasm Evaluation Project. It's breed to sire means for growth traits and carcass traits. And I put that up there just as a reminder that these differences exist from U.S. Mark. And as you think about developing a breeding program that aligns with your objectives, it's important when you choose breeds to understand how they compare for traits of economic importance. Okay, which gets to forming breeding objectives, which is a definition of operational goals in terms of economic importance, a recognition of how you plan on generating replacement females. What's the sale point of your animals? What labor and environmental resources do you have, right? And labor and environmental resources, any limitations there or restrictions turn into economic restrictions, right? You can always get more labor. It just, what are you going to pay, right? You can always get through drought. What are you going to pay, right? So it all comes down to an economic constraint where at some point you say, no, I can't do it, right? Current performance, that's important. What is my current preg rate? What is my current age distribution of cows? Because that determines how important those things are economically to you. And what's your investment horizon? So when I take a bull selection decision today, do I want to look at the return on investment from that decision over the next 5 years, over the next 10 years, over the next 20 years? That's really important to think about. And I'll show you why. Reality is, if I just want to look at the impact of that sire selection decision over the next 2 years, I'm going to focus on output traits, weight. If I'm going to look at the impact of that decision over the next 10 or 20 years, I'm going to put more focus on sustained cow fertility, pregnancy rate, things like that. Okay, things that I'm going to observe over the longer time horizon. So that gets us to a selection index I mentioned, published in the early 1940s, and it's the theory published in the early 1940s, and it's really a formal trade-off among traits, right? So it's a collection of traits which are relevant towards a certain breeding objective, and they're weighted economically. Ooh. And this is probably not an exhaustive, but reasonably close listing of all traits or all indexes in the U.S. beef breed or U.S. Beef industry. I've delineated them as terminal or maternal. Maternal, probably I should say general purpose, because there's still a terminal aspect to them. The point I want to make here is the most popular index in the U.S. beef industry is Angus's dollar B. That's the one that's most heavily used. And that's terminal in nature, right? It assumes that all calves born go through the feedlot, harvested, marketed towards the CAB grid, which is great if that's what you do. But if you keep back replacement females, that's not the right index to use, right? Plain and simple. If you keep back replacement females, you need to use something on the right-hand side. Okay. So I do want to mention some software that I and colleagues built as part of a USDA grant. It's called iGenDeck, and I want to mention it because I used it to create some case studies to talk you through. What iGenDeck does is builds economically optimized selection indexes using the user's input. Okay, so the user tells the system about their breeding objectives, their current herd performance, and things about their herd economics. And so this slide was actually put together by a current master's student of mine. And what he did was he built two selection indexes, one that assumed calves were sold at weaning and one that calves were retained ownership on them through the feedlot and sold them in the beef. And then he looked at perturbing the planning horizon in those two indexes, and that's what's on the horizontal axis going from 2 to 50 years. Remember, planning horizon is looking at the investment timeline. Okay, if I make a sire selection decision, how many years do I want to look at the return on that investment? And then he plotted the relative emphasis. So relatively speaking, how important are certain traits for the breeding objective in terms of their economic importance? And so weaning weight direct, that was the output for the weaning weight index. Hot carcass weight was the output for the more terminal kind of endpoint index. And then both of them did assume that replacement females were retained. So that's what stayability is. It's a stayability EPD. So as the time horizon increased, stayability increased in relative importance. Okay, so the kind of orangish or yellowish is that weaning weight endpoint index. And as the planning horizon increased, the importance of weaning weight direct declined, and the importance, I don't know why I'm using my hand, and the importance of stayability increased. For the hot carcass weight endpoint, over time, the relative importance of increasing hot carcass weight declined, and the relative importance of increasing stayability increased. The reason I say that is sire selection decisions, if you want to improve female fertility, require a longer investment timeline. Okay. In large part because if I want to increase something like weaning weight, I observe that change in the next calf crop. I don't observe a change in stayability in the next calf crop. I don't observe that until several years out. So it takes longer to observe changes. Also, just quickly show this heat map. The W's, right, are the weaning weight index. The C's are the carcass index, and the numbers afterwards refer to the length of the planning horizon. These are Spearman rank correlations, and what it says is within particularly this carcass weight index, if I choose the wrong length of the planning horizon, there could be substantial re-ranking amongst candidate sires. So thinking about this notion of planning horizons important when developing your selection index. Also using iGenDeck, I built this. So what these are, heifer pregnancy and stayability, and these are really the index weights. So a larger index weight means that trait was more heavily emphasized in the selection index. And so I have 4 scenarios. A base scenario where I had purebred Hereford animals with a 80% pregnancy rate and a max cow age of 10. And then one where I assumed there was actually heterosis. So I changed the cows from purebred Hereford to F1s. And so if I compare the index weights for heifer pregnancy and stayability between the base scenario and the scenario where there's heterosis, what happened? Here I'm putting less emphasis on fertility traits in my sire selection. That's because I'm already getting some increase in fertility traits from heterosis, so I don't need to emphasize it as much on the bull side. Here, if I have an improved age distribution, so it's the crossbred scenario, but now the max age of cows in my herd is 12 and I have a 95% pregnancy rate, I emphasize heifer pregnancy and stayability even less. That's because my herd's better than it was before. So I don't need to improve those things as much. Now, if I change to a very poor age distribution, so these are purebred cows with an 80% preg rate and dramatic declines in cow distribution after age 3 and age 8, all of a sudden, now I put a lot more emphasis on something like stayability because my herd has a problem with it. So economically, it's more important for me to improve it. So the unique situations of herds, whether they're purebred, whether they exploit crossbreeding, current cow age distribution, preg rate, all those things determine economically how important it is to improve various traits. And it's not the same for each person in this room. All right, so what have we done to improve the accuracy of selection for fertility? Well, really, it comes down to our ability to better quantify relationships among animals. So this is actually swine data, but trust me, the same is true in beef cattle. This is a density plot that shows relationships between individuals and their grandparents. The expectation of that relationship is a quarter. Okay, you're expected to have a relationship of 1/4 with one of your grandparents. That could range from 0 to 1/2 with no inbreeding. And I'm going to make that assumption for all of you in here. I'm not saying it's right, but I'm going to assume it anyway, okay? And that's what we see, okay? The red bar is our expectation, a quarter. That's about average, but we see a pretty normal distribution going from about 0 to 1/2. And our ability to better quantify relationships among individuals using genomics allows us to increase the accuracy of EPDs. And that's what we've been doing for about the past decade. And so what it does for a trait like sustained cow fertility or heifer pregnancy that's slowly heritable, instead of needing hundreds or thousands of daughter records to get a highly accurate EPD, now we can simply genotype them. And before they've ever sired a calf, we can dramatically increase their accuracy. And that's probably best illustrated by what we call progeny equivalence. So this is Angus, Hereford, and IGS, large multi-breed collaboration, international genetic solutions. Various traits, calving ease, some weight traits, maternal calving ease, milk, marbling, stability. I just pulled some out for examples. But if we focus on this 15 for IGS for stability, that says if I genotype a non-parent bull, think of a yearling bull, I can increase the accuracy of his stayability EPD to be equivalent as if he had 15 daughters out there with observations for that trait before he's ever sired a calf. That dramatically increases the rate at which we can make genetic gain. This is the breeder's equation, which is the amount of change, genetic change we can make per unit of time, which is a function of the accuracy of the EPD, the selection intensity, how choosy we are at picking parents, the genetic standard deviation all over the generation interval. And so what genomics should allow us to do is increase accuracy whilst decreasing generation interval. We have not exploited that fully in beef cattle. Dairy has. Dairy has in a big way, not in beef cattle. Because for some reason in beef cattle, we want to go back and sample that 20-year-old bull that was really good. And that kills generation interval. Absolutely kills it. So the idea is we use a bunch of young parents in the seed stock industry, but we haven't done that yet. I do want to briefly talk about where genetic change occurs. So imagine some individual X, this is sire and dam, and then up here we've got paternal grandsire, paternal granddam, maternal grandsire, and maternal granddam. The progress we make is related to these guys right here, paternal grandsires, the sires of sires. That's the path of selection where we get the biggest bang for our buck. And if you think about the US beef industry, there are very few seed stock producers that really drive genetic change. Maybe 20 in the Angus breed, 4 or 5 in Hereford, 4 or 5 in Simmental, maybe. Not that many breeders that really drive change. They're the ones that are making the sires of sires. As commercial producers, where do we get the biggest bang for our buck? Selecting sires, right? It's bull selection decisions that drive the cow herd, even for sex-limited traits like fertility. It's the bulls you choose that matter. But we put more time into selecting these ones here, the commercial dams, than I would have thought reasonable. Now, I understand that some selection needs to occur, right? Hopefully, you don't need every heifer calf born to replace the mature cow herd. So there has to be some selection. But whether you keep or cull that really good looking one, that's not going to impact your bottom line, okay? It's the bulls you choose that impact it, or the semen you choose. So I understand there are products on the market to help you select or help commercial producers select replacement females, genomic tests, right? I question the return on investment there, knowing that you make progress in sire selection. The other reason I question the return on investment is because there is a plethora of literature out there that shows that those genomic markers, the SNPs, are very sensitive to relationships. So this is an example from 2013 where we used 50,000 markers and developed a prediction for weaning weight and really post-weaning gain, and developed it using Black Angus cattle, and then applied it in Black Angus. And these are the genetic correlations between the results of that test and the trait themselves. And then we also applied that in Red Angus cattle. And the genetic correlations are essentially zero, saying that there's sensitivity here, okay? That even marker effects developed in Black Angus are not transferable to Red Angus. So what that says is if I have commercial females, it's unlikely that I'm going to have a genomic test that's going to be highly predictive and robust across a wide array of breeds. So takeaways, genomic tools have growing application in the seed stock sector, but the value of trait tests are not well proven in commercial herds, right? And the best way for a commercial producer to use genomics is to buy bulls that have genomically enhanced EPDs. I just want to end here with going over some new sources of information. You probably heard about the microbiome, be it rumen, ocular, vaginal, or then methylation epigenetics, which has been shown to be highly predictive of age, right? A lot of interest of that in human settings, right? I'm the age I am. But the question is, maybe am I biologically older or younger than that? Right? Trying to predict what my end date is. There's a lot of interest in that. But these new predictors, epigenetics, the microbiome, are themselves heritable. So on the left, I have a density plot of the heritability of methylation across the bovine genome. So sites that are methylated, and then cumulative methylation, that's heritable. On the right, I have plots of heritability of the microbiome in the rumen of beef cattle at the species, phylum, and family level, again, heritable. In other words, if we want to use this information, be it microbiome, be it epigenetics, to describe variation in things like female fertility, the question is how much does that tell us above and beyond additive genetics, right? That's the question. Does it provide enough new information to make it worth investing in? And to me, that's where that kind of research needs to head. I do want to point out, before I wrap up here, this resource, Beef Sire Selection Manual, available on the eBeef website, has articles meant for extension personnel and beef cattle producers, all things genetics related. And then make just a couple of concluding remarks here that tools do exist to improve fertility in beef cattle genetically. Further development of fertility EPD is needed, and that's going to require leveraging commercial data, I think. I'm not sure that we're going to get it in seed stock sectors. Design crossing systems and within breed selection should be used with advances in management strategies. It's not one or the other. We need to use them in tandem, and that's really important. So with that, if we have time, I'd take any questions. And if nothing else, I deserve some kudos for staying between the goalposts. Thank you. Thank you. Questions?
We'll take one question quick while we're switching out slides here.
So you talked about smaller producers purchasing crossbred replacement heifers for a terminal outcome of that calf. So we know an F1 cross is going to have more hybrid vigor than any other, like an F2 cross. So why would we not want to buy a purebred replacement animal to make that F1 cross with the breeding so we can have a more efficient F1 cross calf to market?
Yeah, so that I'll try to quickly answer that. The idea is that commercial producer would be solely terminal. So they wouldn't be creating any F1 females themselves. So buying a crossbred female allows them to take presumably a third or a different breed of terminal bull to put on them, which would increase heterosis of that calf even more, because now it's a three-way cross. If, however, a commercial producer is large enough, they could actually dedicate a herd that's maternal, quote unquote, to make their own replacements and then have a terminal herd. They could do both on ranch if they're large enough. But my comments were more towards smaller producers that don't have the scale to do that. Yep, thank you.
All right, we'll have more time for questions after we hear from Dare. And our next speaker then has been on our program at least once or twice throughout the years. And again, part of this extension e-beef team that they have referenced with their sire selection manual. And I think you will find that he has some thoughts for you to push your thoughts about impacting reproductive performance and the relationship of milk. And so we'll leave it to him to further explain.
Am I on? We good? All right. I talk a little bit louder than Matt, though. I will not stay between the goalposts, I'm afraid. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to come back and talk to this crowd. It's always, I think, kind of interesting to get with a bunch of reproductive physiologists and the importance of that. I think most of us know, but we're going to go through and talk about some of the aspects or things that might impact reproduction from a genetic standpoint. Now, in hearing Matt's talk, of course, we didn't coordinate at all. I probably should have gone first and then him based on this, but you're going to hear a lot of the same message. And I think Matt and I do think a lot alike a lot of times. That's probably scary for Matt to hear me say that, but I think we do think a lot alike. And so you're going to see some overlap, but we might approach it from a little bit different perspective. So really and truly, I could end this talk right here because the answer to the question is yes. Yes, it does impact reproduction, but we'll go a little deeper than that. So we're here at this reproductive conference, so I'm going to ask you what the most important trait to select for is. Reproduction, right? That's what all the repro guys are going to tell you. I'm going to say no. Now, my genetics colleagues are going to get mad at me when I put up what the most important trait is. It's profit, right? That's what we're after. Now, profit is not a trait. It's really an index. Matt talked about indexes. So it's not truly, so it's a trick question a little bit. But really, I hope that what we can agree to focus on is that we don't necessarily need to increase reproduction. We need to increase profit. And I'm going to tell you, this point got driven home to me in the early 1980s. I was a young college student at Auburn University. And my dad, I grew up in North Central Florida, and we raised about 1,000 head of commercial cattle. And so I went up to Auburn and I got educated. And so I decided I was going to come home and I was going to spread that education to my father. Okay. Any of you ever tried that before? Yeah. Okay. So I get home and I'm talking to my dad about the business and all. And I'm like, so what is your reproduction rate? And he said, we're about 80%. And I said, my God, Dad, that's terrible. We've got to improve that. He said, I'd like for it to be better myself. He said, I tell you what, because my dad, he is a stickler with records. I mean, he knows where every dime is spent for gas, where it goes to, where it came from, where it goes to, labor, everything. And so he has a lot of records. He laid them on the table and he said, you tell me how I can improve my pregnancy rates by 1%. And if it pays for itself, I'll do it. That's a hell of a challenge, right? And I couldn't do it because I found out real quick that I was a lot stupider than I thought I was. Okay. And so sometimes we have to be careful. Let's not always get caught up in looking at those individual things. Let's keep our eye on the prize, the big picture. So what's happened with growth and milk? This is no surprise to anybody that we have seen genetic trends for yearling weight and growth in general skyrocket over the years. Okay. And that's probably, you could go back into the 60s, and that's probably when this trend probably started. And it stops at 2014 there, but I promise you it has not stopped. All of those lines are still in an upward increase. Now, milk's a little different, right? Milk is very breed dependent as to what their direction has been. And it's kind of interesting when you look at the breeds that started off really high, what direction are they taking? They have been told by the industry, you have too much milk, reduce it, or we're not going to buy your bulls, okay? Because some of those breeds didn't fit in certain environments. And so those breeds all started coming down. All the ones that were low are saying, their customers were saying, you got to give me more milk. You got to give me more milk. What happens eventually if you never adapt from that philosophy? You're going to get a big old X up there, right? The breeds that were too low are now too high. Breeds that were too high, maybe at some point in time go too low if we don't adapt. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing. So I'm going to make some assumptions about this talk. First is I'm going to assume that we're in a cow-calf operation, a commercial cow-calf operation. I'm going to assume that we're keeping back replacements because once again, if what Matt said, and I agree with Matt, if we were the most efficient, we would probably be bringing in those replacement females. But that's not what most people do. And so I'm going to, and it would make the talk really short if we didn't assume that we were going to keep back these replacement females. General mating pastures, no targeted matings. In other words, you don't have specific groups that are bred to create your females and another group that you breed them to a terminal bull and sell all those. We're going to assume basically you're buying that bull to cover all aspects. And our motive, once again, is profit. I think we always need to at least shoot for that goal. So let's talk about what production is. Things that go into what you're producing on the farm is going to be the weight of the individual calves, the weight of cows and or bulls that get sold as culls, right? And the number of each of those groups. That's how we come up with total production of an operation. So it's simply within group, the number sold times the average weight of that group. Okay, real simple math. So what are some of the things that impact that? Well, from a growth standpoint, we have genetics for growth, of course. We have genetics for milking ability that since we said we're keeping replacement females, that's certainly going to have an impact. And then the management aspects of it. okay, and the environment that we put them in. And for the most part, all of those kind of have a moderate impact on growth. Matt's already shown you that, because we're talking about here, at least the first two there is the heritability and then the management on the other side of things, okay? So what about reproductive rate, lifetime productivity? Because that's where we get that number aspect, right? Well, we have genetics for fertility as well. Heritabilities are low. I agree with Matt 100%. We can't ignore it. We still need to have it as part of our selection toolbox, but it is a lowly heritable trait, and we have to be aware of that. Calf survival, same thing. We've done very little in terms of our genetic evaluations for trying to get a very good grip on calf survival, and probably need to do a better job there as well. Because to me, when I think of reproduction, I'm not like the Repro Phys guys. When I think of reproduction, it's not just getting them bred. It's not just getting a calf. It's getting a calf all the way to weaning time. She hasn't truly reproduced until she weans her calf, okay? And then management, the environment, that's going to have a much higher impact on the reproductive rate. So we don't know of any known genetic correlations between growth and reproduction. It's been studied, and it doesn't seem to be a great correlation there. There's been some studies that have kind of actually shown it both ways. Some are negative, some are positive, but for the most part, it's not a clear-cut genetic correlation between growth and reproduction. But we do know that there is a very clear relationship between management and reproduction, right? You've all heard the stories about when you get lower body conditioned cattle, their reproduction rate goes down, and it is a drastic effect. And so we know we have to get them fed right, okay? We also know that growth is positively genetically correlated with mature cow weight. Now, since probably not all geneticists in the room, sometimes we have to, I want to go make sure we understand what that means. Positive genetic correlation. Positive does not necessarily mean good. Okay, that's often confused. When we say it's a positive genetic correlation, it just means the relationship of how the two traits interact with each other. And so since it's positive, that means when we select for high growth, the unintended consequence is we get more mature weight on top of that. Okay, because of the positive genetic relationship. If it's negative, then as one goes up, the other goes down. So selection for increased growth also increases what's required for us to feed those cattle. And here's where it's getting important, all right? Because not only are we improving the growth side of things, but we're also having to put more nutrients into those cows that we're keeping back as replacements. For those of you that know me or not, I'll just tell you right now, I always have to have something that pisses me off, okay? So I always have kind of a current pet peeve, all right? My current pet peeve is how we're handling this term mature weight, mature size, okay? So when I put that term up there, what are you thinking? When you see the term mature size, what are you thinking? I'm going to tell you, if you're a scientist, you're probably thinking that. You're probably thinking mature weight. I'm convinced that producers think of mature size as frame size. Who's right? Which one is right in how they're thinking? Well, in most cases, like I found out with my dad, the producer is right. I think this is a case where I have to kind of put it on the side of the scientist, because for the purposes of how we feed cattle, we feed to mature weight. We don't feed to frame size, okay? Frame size has historically been used as an estimate of how big a cow is going to get. So we take a hip height at yearling time, and that projects how big that cow is going to be as a mature cow, right? Everybody understand that's kind of the reason for developing that frame score table that's been used is for that purpose. And there were relationships. We knew a frame 7 was going to be a certain size or should be a certain size mature cow. So let's see how that's going for us, because I say that that's outdated, and I don't have exact evidence, but I think I can paint a pretty good picture. This is genetic trend for yearling height. Okay, in the Angus breed. This is an American Angus. All right. So I was on the judging team in the late 70s and early 80s. This is when, for those of you old enough to know about it, that's when we were on this frame score, trying to get them as big as friggin' possible, right? The motto of my coach was, when in doubt, frame them out, which meant if you don't know what's going on, Bullock, just put the biggest one on top and the littlest on the bottom. Okay. I'm hard-headed too, and I didn't listen to him, but I think I was actually right going back historically, because I had a hard time with those really great big ones that couldn't walk around the ring. But my colleagues didn't agree with me, and we went on that frame score path. But when we decided to turn it around, it happened quick, right? There you'll see in the late 80s, finally got some sense about us and said, we got to stop. And folks, that is amazing that flatlined like that, as far as I'm concerned. That breeders were able to flatline and say, well, we're not going to get them any bigger. Okay. So there is a positive genetic relationship between yearling hip height and mature cow hip height, right? But I'm going to show you evidence that it is clear that this is what producers were selecting for. We should, if they were selecting actually for mature height would have been flatlined as well, right? But it's still been creeping up. So it's put about a half an inch on the cattle since the late 80s. Okay, so I want you to think back to mature height, and if we say that's a predictor of what? What did I tell you we were trying to do with frame scores, which we based on mature on yearling height? Mature weight, right? So how well does it predict it? Not at all, right? We have not slowed down at all on mature weight. So we got them the right height. We just kept getting them bigger and bigger and bigger. And that is a problem, folks. This is what I want you to remember. Cow size, we can think of it two different ways. Height or weight. This is my perspective on it. Mature height is what we look at. And that's what's easy to select for, and that's what we've been selecting for. But that's what we feed. And that's where the problem comes in. We got to understand we have a serious problem here. It's as big a problem, I think, as the frame score deal was back in the 80s, and we got to get control of this. I really think it's important that we get control of that. I'll show you why here in a minute. So for milking ability, increased genetics for milking ability results in heavier weights of weaned calves. That's pretty clear, right? The impact of milking ability on growth to later selling points, though, is reduced. So when you're talking about the maternal effects, and Matt is exactly right. I'm using the word milking ability, but we're really talking about maternal weaning weight, right? And there are some maternal components to yearling weight and carcass weight. It's just they're greatly reduced from what we typically see for that maternal weaning weight, okay? There's evidence actually of a positive genetic correlation between increased milking ability and reproduction. There's been some studies that have shown actually a positive relationship there. The implication of reproduction, if increased nutrient demands are not met, is compromised again. So we have both cases. If we get them really big, we have to feed them more or we're going to lose reproduction. If we put a lot of milk in them, their nutrient requirements go up. If we don't feed them, we're going to lose reproduction again. So are there some breed differences? I want you to think about it. I'm I'm going to show you the same thing Matt did about the work out of the Mid-Animal Research Center, but in a little different version here in a second. But do the breeds actually still perform like we expect? I think a lot of us still think of how we first were introduced to the breeds and what their production levels were as opposed to reality. Because when we talk about selection, this is the first step of selection, or should be, is breed choice. And then going in after you've made your breed choice based on that good sound crossbreeding program, then go in and do the selection based on EPDs. Back when I was in school, this was very clear cut. We had different breed types. We had the British cattle, we had the continental milk, we had the continental draft, we had the American breeds, and each of them served different purposes and were utilized pretty much in the right way. Have they maintained that? What would today would we call them maternal breeds? We used to say from a maternal breed, like Matt was talking about how the swine industries and all, they use maternal lines, paternal lines. We used to do that. We used to say, if you want a smaller kind of a maternal line, use a British breed. If you want something that's a little more growthy and has milk, and you have the resources to support it, use a continental milk breed. If you need a terminal breed, then use the continental draft. If you're in the Gulf Coast area or whatever, use some American breeds. We had a specific spot for them. I challenge you to look at that and tell me where those groups fall out now. Now, it's the same thing Matt showed you with numbers, but I'm more of a visual person. So this is just trying to give you an idea of how the breeds relatively rank. The number of X's is not statistical differences. It is simply trying to show you some relative differences. So Angus, back when I was growing up, was what we would call a very moderate milking, moderate growth breed. This chart is ranked based on yearling growth. So Angus is the top yearling growth breed now. You can also see they have some of the heaviest mature weights and some of the heaviest carcass weights. They are now one of the top milking breeds. What is too much? When are we going to get to the point of too much? Simmental, traditionally a high growth, high milk breed. You can still see they're still up there on the growth side. They have drastically reduced. Oh, I'll tell you what, I went in and put color in here to show you this actually. How about that? So Angus, I just talked about. Now the Simmental, moderate now on their milking ability, because they were told, like I said, it's that X that I was talking about for genetic trends. Getting different signals or just not listening to the signals they're getting, somebody is, and I'm not going to say who's right and who's wrong. Gelby, interesting, maintained very high growth, but you'll see one of the smaller mature weight breeds. That to me is a pretty positive aspect. Still pretty high on the milk side of things, and relatively still maintain a relatively heavy carcass weight as well. Brahma breeds here in Texas got at least mentioned. I think that. Whoops. That would be a great concern. We have to remember for this study that was on British cross cows. And I think most of you guys know that at least when you use Brahma breeding on Brahma influenced females, there is a maternal component that helps keep that birth weight down. Very high on the weaning weight side of thing. Fairly large mature weights on them as well. Profitability. How are we going to get there? Because that's our goal, right? All my students will be able to tell you this, because I teach the beef production class, and they can all tell you that profit equals income. Everybody agree? Hate to tell you, we've got some producers that think that as well. But hopefully you guys realize that's not correct, right? Profit equals income minus costs. It's so easy just to forget about that cost side of things. It's so dadgum complicated. So the income side of things, we talked about production before, and so we just take production times price. So let's break back down how we had production measured out, which was the number of calves times that calf weight times the calf price. But then we got to bring in our culls as well, right? So if we add all that together, yeah, there might be some other things out there, but for the most part, that's what we're looking at from the income side of the equation. Okay. Cost side of things. Okay. Certainly, this is the big one in most cases. Health, marketing, labor, and now since I figured there were some of you that thought of other things that I didn't think of, I put in overhead. So if you're thinking of it and I didn't, put it in overhead. All right. So that's just everything else. So now when we look at the big picture of profitability, all that income side minus all of that cost side of things. So what can we do about this from a genetics perspective? So these are the big ones. And I know there's other things that impact genetics, and hopefully we'll kind of get to that. But for the most part, the number of calves we have, so the reproduction, survival, those are the genetics that play a role there. Calf weight, of course, the genetics for weight. Feed, that's our conversion, right? How efficient they are at converting feed from a genetic standpoint. So those are the big ones. Now, calf price, not for the purpose of this talk, but I will throw it out there because, of course, there's other things, right? Like the color of the calf, the quality of the calf, those might be some genetic things that will impact that calf price as well. So calf weight, yes, it's on a positive. So if we increase the growth of the calves, that increases the income side, right? It also increases the cow weight because of that positive genetic correlation. So still we're in good shape, right? From an income side of things, we've done two positive things to impact income when we select for growth. But we know that relationship is there as well, right? Because the bigger cows require more feed. So that bumps up on the cost side of things. And we know that if we don't take care of that, if we don't increase the feed that we're providing to those cattle, what happens? It impacts the number of calves, right? In a negative way. So we have to be careful about that. Now, also what affects the number of calves, if we have poor conception rate, poor fertility, and we have, what do we usually do with those cows? So we had a small calf crop to start with. We have a bunch of open cows. Almost everybody sells open cows, right? So we sell them. So now we have to, we sell more, so it increases our income, but it's fewer calves that we have now to market. So there's a lot of complexity to this, a lot of interactive moving parts, so to speak. And so let's try and get I'm glad to hear Matt use the word return on investment, because it's a very important one. So what is it? We have to determine the cost of a practice. We have to determine the income associated with that practice. And then for every dollar invested, we need to determine how much is returned. And it's simple, guys. For every dollar that we invest, it has to at least provide us back with $1, or we're losing money. Hopefully, it's going to produce more than $1. So let's look at it from a growth standpoint. We have our investment of the additional cost for genetics. If you buy those high EPD bulls, you're going to probably pay a little bit more for them. Cost associated with raising a bigger calf, probably not great, but it's there. Cost associated with developing a larger mature cow, that's probably fairly significant, because to get them up to that target weight to breed, all of that is going to take more resources. And Dr. Dave Lawman, and I know he spoke at this conference before. If you haven't heard him talk about his mature cow and milk, it's a really good talk. But he's done a lot of work on it, and he basically figured out that it takes about $42 of additional investment or cost per hundredweight of cow that you have. Okay. So about $42 now, and that's not based on today's cost because we all know what's happened over the past year or 2 years in terms of what costs have done, right? They've gone out the roof. All right, so that's probably even much higher today. So on the return side, we have the additional income, and he looked at a number of different studies that have looked at income based on cow weight. And it was as low of the studies he looked at as $6 per hundredweight of cow to $30 per hundredweight of cow. Additional income, I haven't raising those bigger calves. There's also additional income from having heavier cull cows. Now, he speculates that that probably evens out with that cost of developing the larger cow. So he kind of calls that a wash. Bottom line, for every dollar invested in additional growth, returns about 75 cents. That's not on the positive side, folks. Now, you see my little star there? Because there's a lot to really consider here. First of all, the relationship's not linear, and Dave suggests that as you get bigger, it actually hurts you significantly. In other words, it's harder to get the return on investment, but it also happens the same way on the bottom end. If we get them too small for things like small frame calves and all that, we can get them too small and it starts actually decreasing the return on investment as well. Farrell and Jenkins did a classic study back in, I can't remember now when it was, I think 70s or 80s, where they kind of showed that there is definitely an optimum cow weight or productivity level of cattle. And I think that's what this basically is telling us too. Don't want them too small, don't want them too big, we want them just right. So how about milk? Our investment is once again additional cost for those genetics of milk, cost associated with milk production, working out, doing this with grazing. So not with concentrates, but doing it with grazing, it costs about $5 a cow for an additional 10 pounds of weaning weight on those calves through the maternal milk aspect, okay? The cost, and also there's a cost associated with increased maintenance because those high milking cows, even when they're not milking, have a higher maintenance cost as well. So it's not just when they're producing, they have bigger hearts, bigger livers, all that sort of stuff that cost more as well. The return is the additional calf weight. And figuring $1.80 a pound, that's about $18 of calf based on the 10 pounds of additional weight, okay? So what about our return on investment there? It's actually showing us that there's a very good return on investment on the milk side. And I'm going to tell you that this is one of those pills that you sometimes have to swallow. I thought milk was the big culprit in causing a lot of our problems of getting cattle under conditioned and causing some reproductive problems. I'm starting to think a little differently now. Once again, there are some caveats there, again, not linear and so forth. And particularly when you put cattle in harsh environments, the harsher the environment, the harder it is to show that return on investment. Okay, so be careful, particularly in harsh environments. So bottom line, select for high growth and milking ability without additional nutrient resources, you're going to kill your reproductive rate. If you do that, it's very hard to be profitable. Okay. Even with good nutrients, even in a good environment, we are probably getting close, particularly on that mature weight side of things, of getting the cattle where they just cannot consume enough of it to still maintain their body condition and thus reproduction. So we have to be careful. We can stretch it to the limit. They just can't graze enough to get it done. Currently, mature weight, I think, is the bigger concern. That's the one I think that we're in critical need of getting a handle on. But I think we need to rethink that whole thing, particularly those breeds that are still on a pretty sharp incline for milk. We need to think about that one as well. So the solution, moderation. It's what you hear everywhere all the time, right? That's the solution. Now, Matt showed you a tool that I am going to mention too, because this is really, the selecting for profitability is a selection index. if set up properly, and if it matches your scenario, and this is a customized one, so it better match your scenario, then that is truly selecting for profitability when you select on that index. Okay, because it does take into account and gives the correct cost associated with things like growth, milk, and so forth. Breed for normal conditions and then manage through disasters. We can't breed our cattle to always face the disaster times or the great times. And I think we have producers that do some of both. You need to breed your cattle for the normal and then try and manage through those hard times. But look at every one of those as a return on investment. Don't say, I've got to have 90% calf crop. I don't care if there's a drought. I'm going to buy enough feed to get my cows bred. If it doesn't return, okay, make sure it returns. My take home message. And I think that's unfortunately what we do in the cattle business too much is, by golly, if it's out there and it's achievable, I'm going to get there. We don't always have to do that. And I will be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, and we'll have Matt move back up to participate in the Q&A. And let me bring you this mic over here.
What is going to be the effect of a carbon print with these big animals?
I'm sorry,
The carbon print, what is going to be the effect with these large cattle?
the carbon footprint. I wish I knew better, but I can tell you what, how we can best reduce the carbon footprint is through efficiency. And I think total efficiency of production. So we usually think of efficiency as just feed efficiency, and that's a big one. If we improve feed efficiency, we're reducing the carbon footprint. But overall total production efficiency, which is inclusive, I think, Matt, you might have even mentioned it in yours. That's that keeping reproduction rate, hopefully at an optimum level, as well as improving on that feed efficiency. Those are the ways that we're going to improve, I think, our carbon footprint. Does that answer it at all? I mean, we don't have an EPD for it. I can tell you that. So all you can do is try and improve on efficiencies. I mean, I think in terms of trying to reduce, you know.
You just can't keep on growing animals that are just.
And that, I hope that was kind of what my point was. I mean, for a lot of reasons, economic efficiency, carbon footprint, I think we benefit in both cases by optimizing as opposed to maximizing.
Yeah, and you'll lose, you will. With that, you're going to lose reproduction, no matter what you say. And that's the dairy industry. It loses a reproduction.
I think that is what I said.
Well, you said it in other words, but that is true.
Yeah. Anything to add on that, Matt? Jump in the fire, buddy.
Next question. I'll ask one. Is there, do you think we should stop mature weight and height where we're at? You know, we're the packing industry seems to have been happier, or, you know, happy as these carcasses got bigger. What do you see for a goal?
What I personally think is I think that we have absolutely got to cap mature cow size, and weight is what I'm talking about, because we have capped mature cow height. I mean, like I say, over the past 20 something years, we've put a ½ an inch on there. That's not a lot, but we've also put, I think it's over 100 pounds of additional mature cow weight during that same time period. And to me, getting that paid for based on that return on investment, we're not paying for it. So we're putting it on there. And the only way that you even have a slight chance of maybe paying for it is if you do have retained ownership all the way through, and then you're also taking advantage of those heavier carcasses as well. But it's still, to me, the numbers don't pan out. And so, I think that not only, Sandy, I think we need to think about even bringing it back down some, even at the cost maybe of some growth.
Basically, animal, the first thing you're growing is bone, and I don't think nobody eats bones.
So I'd just maybe add to that. I think it's fairly simple that most commercial cattle producers should select decreased mature cow size. The notion that cow size needs to get bigger to have larger fed cattle is just ridiculous. We don't need big cows to have big yearlings. And so a real world example, Goodmanson Sandhills Laboratory, our Western University of Nebraska ranch. So they have honest 1,150 pound cows. They'll kill 1,500 pound yearlings, right? And they do that by using technology. So those are implanted cattle. And bull selection is from right around breed average or slightly less than breed average for growth traits. So we can make big fed cattle without big cows, no doubt.
Their frame size is always smaller than ours by law. And they have are considered to have the best genetics in the Angus breeds and some other breeds just because of that.
Like I said before, I don't think frame size is a problem. I don't have a problem with how tall Angus cattle are. I have a problem with how much they weigh, and cattle in general.
Matt, the IDEC is now ready for us to use. I keep meaning to go and look at that, but it's done and use it.
So iGenDeck, that software I mentioned, what we did in the development of that is decided that we didn't want it to be like all other federally funded projects. The grant ends and, we write a paper and it goes away. So we did two things to make it widely available. One, we put the source code in the public domain. So the source code for that software is on GitHub, which means it's, anyone in the world can grab it, install it. Now, realizing most beef cattle producers aren't going to grab a whole bunch of computer code and install it themselves. We also put an implementation of it on a server that the Beef Improvement Federation manages. So the beef industry then can gain access to the web version of that software through the Beef Improvement Federation, BIF. And to make that sustainable, BIF will charge an access fee so that they can maintain the servers. But that's where that software will live in perpetuity so that it's available to really North American beef cattle producers and breed associations. Yep.
I was on the advisory committee for Matt's project, and so I got to play around with it. It is a really, really neat tool. I do encourage you to look into it.
Other questions? You really can push these guys. I mean, Dan.
So the question other, how as a commercial producer, how as a commercial producer, can we select for reproductive efficiency? We have management tools, we have the information, call cows, open cows, that kind of stuff. But from a genetic standpoint, how can we select for reproductive efficiency?
The number one way on the bull side is selecting for, and it depends on what breed, whether they call it stayability or sustained cow fertility, but an EPD that is centered on really sustained or, longevity, sustained fertility or longevity. That's the number one thing producers can use in bull selection. Here's the problem with that though. Those kind of EPDs are available for any breed that's a part of IGS. It's available for Hereford, but the most popular breed in the US does not currently have an EPD for that. They're working on it, but they don't currently have. So that's an issue. But that's the chief thing, is to select based on that. And then the second is in tandem to implement a structured crossbreeding program. And to understand that culling open cows is not the same as selection for fertility. Right? Getting rid of the open one isn't selecting to increase fertility, because there's a lot of reasons she could come up open that have nothing to do with genetics. So culling open cows is a management level decision. That's not a genetic decision.
Okay, any more questions?
I just add to that too, that, I mean, if possible, right, you don't want an open cow to leave the ranch. What you want is to get her bred, even if it's late, and sell her bred off the ranch. I mean, that's the goal. So a late bred female is worth something to somebody, and that's more than what an open's worth.
It's because she's bred late doesn't mean we have to keep her. We have a choice. Anyone else? All right, well, I think, oh, here.
When we're looking at the growth of these cows and the higher cow weights that we're seeing, are those coming on muscle growth in those cows and higher efficiency of the animals? Or is it because we're just overfeeding them and they're getting fat cows?
It's gonna be probably some of both, because the mature weight thing, even on an adjusted basis for body condition score, we're still seeing the same genetic trends. As a matter of fact, that's what the genetic trend is on the corrected. And so if you think about it, if we're keeping them basically the same height, but we're getting them heavier, it can only be a couple of things. Length, I don't know that we're getting them that much longer. I know we're getting them wider, and we're putting more guts in them. I think that the difference is basically internal organ weight is going to probably be a big part of it. But and some on the muscling, but just it's got to be girth and basically width is where we've got to be coming up with it, because they're not getting taller, right? So we're getting them deeper bodied. Nobody eats bones. Nobody eats depth of body either. And I'm a big depth of body guy. I like to see those deep bodied cows too, but I just don't know how much it's benefiting us.